They cooked without cookbooks, survived without supermarkets, and somehow made meals we've completely forgotten, packed with creativity, resourcefulness, and the harsh lessons of frontier life. These lost pioneer recipes reveal a world of survival, grit, and surprising flavor. Sourdock soup is something that is considered a massive staple among pioneers who relied on wild greens. They were the type of people who would basically live off of eating vegetables, so go figure. It was also kind of known as a curly dock. These were wild plants with tarts, and they had these really citrusy, lemony leaves. The thing about them, though, was that they loved growing in disturbed soil across the region of North America. Not to imply that people didn't really like it, though, because after winter, all you can do is just eat whatever God gives you. A basic sourdock soup was mostly just made of really foraged items that people had been scavenging for. You had some cornmeal and flour in there too, and a lot of broth. What people would always throw in there were wild onions and lard or butter. The dock leaves were something that had to be washed really thoroughly, though. Wouldn't want any of their mud getting stuck between your teeth. This dish was a demonstration of the adaptability of settlers and how they were able to get by even before gardens could start giving out fresh produce. Mormon scones were a very Utah-associated pioneer dish that resembled deep-fried biscuit dough more than anything else. These aren't the kind of things you're thinking. I know your head may have immediately gone over to traditional British scones, but we're working with something else. These actually had the privilege, honor, and esteem of being created by the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. They had settled in Utah during the middle of the 19th century, but instead of finding more of God, it seems they found their talent for cooking. Whipping up Mormon scones with some flour, baking powder, water, lard, and molasses, these scones went around the kitchen and finished fast. They were simple, crispy, but extremely fragrant and delightful to bite into. It was definitely the kind of comfort food you would want when you were really tired from work. Plus, Mormon pioneers were extremely dependent on wheat, did you know? This recipe was a way for them to make flour-based foods a lot easier to digest. The practice, though, is something that's rooted in Native American fry bread. That's a whole other topic for another video, but if you ever want to try some decently fried bread, here you go. Fatback and beans were basically just a southern and frontier staple that was extremely, deeply beloved by anyone who ever had to work a field. I'm talking trappers, poachers, bowmen, farmers, loggers, foragers, tribesmen, and anybody else you can imagine that might have something to do with some random neck of the woods. Why was it so popular? I don't know. Why do gym bros obsess over whey protein? Why does everyone want a Gatorade? Back then, everybody thought that these were simply the best things to eat when you wanted a calorie-dense meal that could give you a lot of energy to last throughout the day. Plus, they had an incredible amount of protein as well. Fatback and dried beans were most commonly associated with people who worked labor-intensive jobs. They had navy beans, Great Northern beans, pinto beans, and water. They were something that was ideally made with molasses or brown sugar if it was available, but if it wasn't, then that would be okay. You would soak the beans, cook the fatback, simmer them, and then slow cook them. These optional sweeteners were helpful, but they were not necessary. Fatback was actually one of the most accessible cuts of pork you could get for yourself. It wasn't like fresh meat, it had been salted thoroughly for preservation, and that made it extremely ideal for pioneers because they did not have access to preservation methods besides ice boxes, which wouldn't last too long. Beans were also the backbone of frontier meals because they were such a cheap, transportable, and long-lasting dish. Hasty pudding was something that originated in England, was an extremely wheat-based porridge, and it was also something that most people thought was much more available than things like bacon or eggs sometimes. Cornmeal has always been the primary grain of America, and while this might have changed recently due to so many advancements in, well, everything, that doesn't mean that for the large majority of history, corn has been top dog as far as everyone's concerned, pioneer or not. Cornmeal was also more abundant than wheat ever was, so sometimes when people wouldn't have any wheat to spare for this, they would just substitute it out with cornmeal. You would boil it until it was simmering, and then you needed to stir it until it thickened, and hey, That took a real gentle touch sometimes. This pioneer version of the hasty pudding recipe is actually the original. It's what led to the American version later too, which is honestly almost exactly the same, so I'm not sure why we classify them as different versions. Kind of like saying color versus color, you know? Squirrel Stew, something that's been used by so many different kinds of groups and people that it's really hard to call it just a pioneer-only recipe, but I digress. See, Squirrel Stew was basically the peanut butter and jelly of the frontier. It was the quintessential meal to have during those times, and this was largely undebatable. There was nothing that was as abundant as squirrels were, not even close. You could spot enough of them to last you for days on just a casual Monday stroll out into the area to check what's going on. Wild game was significantly more available than any kind of domesticated meat. The people that did have that were ranchers and farmsteaders, and they naturally weren't too keen on sharing the things they ran their trade on. The stew started out as just being something people made to survive, but it started to grow into something that people found actually relatability in. Squirrel Stew became something that, like I said, everyone had tried at some point or the other. So if anyone in your bloodline had any business in the frontier, for, whatever reason, chances are they probably know what squirrel tastes like. Hardtack was something that was an ultra-simple and long-lasting bread that had become extremely good with pioneers and sailors. It's also something that Civil War soldiers loved. Basically, anybody with a background in handling guns and shooting them for the government, aka the military, would be in love with it. Why? Well, in hard times where combat is an expectation you have daily, fresh bread becomes hard to find, and the bread you do have, well, it goes unfresh really fast. These were hence known as journey biscuits because they would be something that soldiers would carry with them through incredibly long treks and still bring out of their pocket, just as edible as the day they put it in there. Hardtack had no yeast and leavening, and that's basically what let it last as long as it did. Flour was used, water would be used, and salt would be used. It had to be cooled, but it only needed to be in airtight tins or cloth biscuits at best. Hardtack could actually last you years, and I'm not joking when I say that. Hardtack was really lightweight, durable, and it was a perfect trail food for all kinds of people who lived life out on the road. Beaten biscuits required a lot of beating, as you may be able to tell. They were a big Appalachian staple, and they had originated in Kentucky and Virginia before they had become widespread across most of the known frontier. Unlike soft baking powder biscuits, these were crisp and dense biscuits that were a lot more similar to a cracker than they were to something a typical soft, chewy biscuit. Instead of using yeast and baking powder, pioneers aerated the dough by beating it up. Pretty standard protocol, right? How long do you think that beating went on? Because if you beat something for 1 consecutive hour straight, I'm more inclined to say that you were simply taking something out on it. Just kidding. All that love and effort paid back off when they would get an incredibly chewy, layered, and puffy biscuit that was just a complete delight to eat in every way. Pickled watermelon rind was a dish that was a classic preservation method of the South, more than it was a recipe, really. And on the frontier, everything that could possibly make your food last longer mattered as much as gold. Pickled watermelon rind was an extremely good way to do that too, because settlers had a way of using every part of a watermelon. The rind was really helpful. Pioneers would pickle them to make a treat that could basically last a lot longer than the fruit itself. The white portion of it would be cut into strips and cubes, while the rest of it would basically be brined. You would soak the rinds overnight in saltwater brine so that the bitterness could be drawn out. These rinds were simmered in a mixture of vinegar and spices until they were translucent, and the pickled rinds had to be placed in airtight jars before the process was done. The end result was a tangy, watermelon-centered treat that could actually be fresh for months and even years. Pickling watermelon rind was zero-waste cooking taken to its most extreme. Long-term preservation was the name of the game, and by picking up the skills of the communities that had already lived there for so long and innovated recipes like these, pioneers got by. Dandelion green salad should have been a superfood, because I think it passes all the criteria to be one. I mean, you really do feel like spring has arrived when you start seeing meadows and prairies loaded with dandelion greens. These were among the first and freshest ones available, and they were an important source of vitamins. Dandelion greens were something that people loved so much because they had an extremely mild flavor. The vinegar was very important here because it had to be homemade herb vinegar, otherwise it would interfere with the taste. The greens were pickled early in the season so that you wouldn't have to deal with too much bitterness. Foraged dandelions were an incredible source of vitamins A and C, and those were really helpful at boosting your immunity. This is something that communities, especially pioneer ones, particularly needed because their immunities would usually be pretty weak after tough winters. Early settlers brought whatever knowledge of foraging they had, where dandelions were already commonly used in everyday salads and herbal remedies, so this was never too much of a change for them. I think it actually made them feel closer to home. Shoo-Fly Pie was a Pennsylvania Dutch and Amish classic instead of a pioneer food, but it was something they used early on a lot too. Shoo-Fly Pie actually goes all the way back to the 18th and 17th centuries. Pioneers were never really working with a lot of fresh fruit or sugar, and they also had to worry about affordability. They would try to cope with all these issues by substituting fruit with molasses, and the rest was just your typical assortment of a pie. Believe it or not though, sometimes having an egg would be one of the most important things you could put in this dish. An egg gives a custard-like texture, especially if you beat it for like a quarter of the time people spend on beaten biscuits. The molasses mixture was also really custard-like at the very bottom, and the filling was firm. It was more popular among Appalachian and Pennsylvania Dutch communities. The name Shoo-Fly Pie comes from the sticky and sweet molasses that would actually attract a lot of flies. And what do you do when flies are around? Well, naturally you shoo them away. Get it? The beautiful thing about puns is that much like food, they connect us to groups of people we have nothing to do with throughout history. Salt-rising bread was something that was a fermentation-based bread that was developed by pioneers in Kentucky and the Midwest before commercial yeast started to become available. It was not salty, but the name came from the fact that the salt box storage method was used to keep the dough warm. And that method is exactly what it sounds like, where you basically coat meat with salt, allow it to cure, and then store it in a box. I know, riveting, right? It actually works for bread too. Now, besides that, a basic salt-rising bread needs 5 things. That would be milk and water for moisture, cornmeal, which could be substituted with boiled potatoes, flour, and ideally wheat flour, salt, and some baking soda. Pioneers would pretty much make this over open fires and then let it sit overnight so it could ferment in peace. You would also get a really nice cheesy smell thanks to the bacteria that were fermenting in the mixture. So there you would have a salt box with the cheesiest smell coming out of and a bread that was getting softer every minute. It took only a little bit of work to make, and it was ideal. Jerky and tallow pemmican were actually almost always made together. This 2-part survival ratio was something that would be an ideal harmony of everything your body needed. You had a balanced combination of protein, fat, and a lot of long-term energy. This was a pairing that was really essential for pioneers, frontiersmen, and Native American tribes. Same reason all the other food that managed to spread across all these different communities got so popular. It's what kept them going. Really, it is. The amount of energy that was in pemmican alone was astounding. It's more than enough for our daily standards. But when you mixed thinly sliced jerky in it, which was usually bison, elk, or deer beef, you would get a superfood. This would be salted and mixed with wild herbs and spices too. The rendered bison fat, the tallow basically, was a big part of why this was such an amplified version of the typical pemmican recipe. This food was most likely the closest people could come at that time to crafting a one-size-fits-all meal. See, jerky on its own could last you weeks and months, but when you mix that in with pemmican and tallow, it could go on for years. That was a packed bomb of energy that could literally be deployed in any moment throughout the year. Scrapple was a really resourceful and no-waste recipe that prioritized the everyday needs of the times back then. Funnily enough, for something that was suited to the regular life of somebody from that time period, they were made by German immigrants, the Pennsylvania Dutch, in the 18th century. Pioneers and butchers would often use them as a way to put some pork scraps to use and extend lots of meat supplies from boiling the scraps. They were also thickened with cornmeal, strained as much as they could be, and poured and set into a mold. Pioneers had one thing in common with the locale, which is that they really did not appreciate wasting any part of a pig. Scrapple helped to stretch meat supplies by combining all kinds of pork with grains, and it was given a long shelf life thanks to the fact that it was always turned into a loaf. Scrapple could then be sliced and used as needed while you could keep the rest stored. Apple Pan Dowdy was a comfort food that was as homely as they come. This was basically really similar to cobbler, to help give you an idea of the kind of dish we're talking about. The Pan Dowdy aspect of it refers to the dowdying method, which is essentially breaking up or pressing down on the crust. It creates a thick and syrupy apple filling, and apple pan dowdy is something that was loved dearly by home cooks and bakers throughout the 18th and 19th centuries. You had to have fresh or dried apples, and they would be tossed with just a rush of everything sweet. I'm talking sugar, cinnamon, butter, molasses, and everything else. That, combined with the fact that this was such a no-fuss recipe that didn't end with any kind of careful rolling or dough shaping, meant that people took to this very nicely. Molasses were a sweetener that would help a lot because sugar was really expensive, and the overall recipe was extremely adaptable to what people had on hand. Ash cakes were also known as journey cakes, but for a different reason. These were the most popular among Native American tribes and pioneers, and they were a favorite of soldiers, mostly because of the fact that they were extremely simple, like even soldiers could make them, you know? A very bare bones and basic ash cake recipe just needed cornmeal, water, and salt. If you had some lard or any kind of animal fat to put in there, even better, but it wasn't a necessity. The cornmeal, water, and salt would be combined and they would make a really thick dough, and the lard and tallow was used for extra calories. The dough was formed into disc-shaped cakes, and they weren't really that big, let's say. They would be about the size of an average hand. Whatever that is. Anyway, cakes were placed right into the embers of a fire, and then they would be covered with ashes, hence the name. When they'd be done baking, and that would just take around 5 to 10 minutes, people would dust off the ash and enjoy the slightly charred crust, which was perfectly edible, I promise. Ash cakes were helpful because no equipment was ever needed, and they were long-lasting and dense. Ash cakes could last through rough terrain and environments without crumbling, getting squashed, and they were perfectly enjoyable just plain, you know. Chokecherry syrup, on the other hand, was something made of these small, tart berries of chokecherry trees. They were very widely used by Native American tribes and different kinds of pioneers, but the berries themselves were far too bitter to eat raw. They had to be boiled and reduced down to a syrup, and they were also really good at cooling you down once you ate them. You know how some foods just feel like so refreshing and breezy to eat? This is one of those. Chokecherry syrup was really popular because chokecherry trees were really common. No matter the era, nobody ever turned down free food. Although some may say there is no such thing as a free meal back then, if it grew out of the ground and you found it, it was yours. Provided it was safe to eat. Do you ever think about the people who were the test runs for whether or not something is safe to eat? The syrup was a really natural sweetener too, so it was always easy to source the ingredients you needed for this game. Hen Pot Pie is something that was really beloved by early American settlers. I think they felt like it was a piece of home because the idea was based on the traditional classic British meat pies that they would enjoy back there too, just with a lot of compromise to suit the ingredients that were available. Pioneers had started using wild game birds for one, instead of chickens that had been specifically domesticated for this purpose. Squirrel, quail, and pigeons were the most common, but sometimes you'd get super lucky and find a game hen too. The rest of the dish had things like carrots, potatoes, and turnips, and lots of onions and garlic. The game hen was something that had to be prepared before it could work as a filling. Vegetables were chopped and cooked with onions, sure, but it was really the filling that brought it all together. Unlike the rest of this list, this isn't some survivalist's Tuesday snack, it's a special dish for a special day. Game hens were not the kind of thing you'd eat every day, and even if they didn't have game hens and they were just working with squirrels, the sentiment was still there. People combined meat and vegetables with gravy, and pioneers could basically feed people with fewer resources. Parched corn was a dish that was entirely a Native American invention, but the benefit was shared by everyone because it was used by everyone. From soldiers and pioneers down to wayfaring explorers just looking to get by. This was something that they came up with when they thought of roasting dried corn kernels. The idea was to make them really lightweight and non-perishable, easy to take around with you in large batches and to make it resistant to spoilage. In terms of drying the corn, the kernels were left on the cob until they had hardened completely. They were roasted in a pan or a fire. People would usually use dry skillets for this, and the seasoning was also really minimal, just a bit of fat so that it would give you more energy to eat. Now, as far as storage goes, once it was cooled, parched corn had become something that was stored in leather bags. It could be thrown in stews, soups, it could work as a snack, it could be eaten on its own, you could use it as a topping with meat or in a sandwich. The possibilities were endless. Hog and hominy is something that's rooted in so many traditions that it becomes a bit hard to grasp where it really comes from. The combination of pork and corn has been a recorded dietary staple in a lot of Native American tribes. Indigenous peoples such as the Cherokee and the Creek always prepared hominy. They would often soak the corn in lye and wood ash so that the hull would be removed and its nutritional value could be increased. Enslaved Africans were also very much known for incorporating and introducing pork and turning this into a savory dish. It was a recipe and combination that transcended any kind of divides and barriers of the time because it simply fit the palates of everyone in the country. The dried corn went excellently with the salt pork and bacon. One of the biggest reasons this dish had so much success is also because the salt pork and bacon could be substituted for hog jowls so that nose-to-tail cooking could still be followed. Besides that, the taste of it was just amazing. It was deeply savory, but not in an overly gamey way, and the seasonings and corn shined through just right. It was a nourishing meal that showcased the best of European farming concepts, African culinary influences, and Native American agricultural techniques. Wild onion and venison hash was a really popular meal all over the frontier, and it was something hunters and different kinds of trappers particularly loved. Early pioneers that relied on game meat and foraged ingredients wanted this more than anything because it was something that could be made with the most basic of ingredients minus the venison. Native American tribes, especially the Cherokee and Shawnee tribes, were regular users of wild onions in almost all of their cooking. Deer meat in general was the most common game you could find across the frontier. However, the cuts of meat that were used for this recipe were tough, and they either had to be slow cooked, or if there wasn't enough time for that, they had to be shredded. Any fresh meat, though, would be pan-fried in tallow until it was golden brown. The wild onions, when sautéed, actually differ from the ones we're used to. They have a much stronger but also more bitter flavor. This dish highlighted the importance of having recipes in your back pocket that make the best use out of the terrain you live in. Pioneers and Native Americans led lifestyles of foraging, so whatever was available in the woods that day is what they were going to be eating. It helped to have recipes that made it easier to get what you want out of an unpredictable pantry like that. Blackberry stump is a baked boiled fruit dish that was made from wild blackberries, flour, and lard or butter. This name refers to blackberry vines that were growing up near old tree stumps. Pioneers were a community of people who did not have a lot of ingredients to work with. The desserts they did make were pretty rustic and unrefined, and they relied more on wild fruit than anything else. Basic pantry staples like wild blackberries and flour and lard or butter were really important. Wild blackberries were also so available, and you did not have to go out of your way to find them. You could get hedgerows that were nearby, fences, and just in general, you could find them growing on the side of the road too. Mixing the flour was also relatively easy. With a bit of lard and water, it worked well enough as dumpling dough. If the dish was baked, it would resemble a cobbler, but if it was boiled, it would be a lot more like a syrup-y pudding. One of the best benefits of this dish is that it can work in either the summer or the winter. You could serve this dessert cold or hot, so whatever your environment was, it was a dish you could rely on thanks to easily available ingredients and a wide range of uses. Pork drippings gravy was something that was a massive necessity in pioneer and southern cooking as well. It used rendered fat that would be left after people had made dishes out of bacon or ham. This kind of shows you just how innovative people really were back then. I mean, who thinks of that? Using the drippings on a pan for your next meal of the day? Anyway, after rendering the pork fat, people would get to work on thickening the gravy. This was as simple a process as you might expect. There's not a lot of room for complicated cooking techniques here because these people weren't working with those kinds of kitchen appliances or those kinds of ingredients. After the gravy was thickened with a bit of cornmeal and flour, a mixture of liquid was added. This was simmered until the gravy had become completely thick, and then it would be poured over cornbread and fried potatoes. Pioneers really believed in not wasting a single ingredient, even the ones that were stuck to the bottom of the pan. Molasses taffy was a staple among pioneers and different rural families. The Appalachia and Midwest regions were where you would see this the most often. It was much more expensive to use sugar, even brown ones, so people often used sorghum syrup and molasses. That was the primary sweetener for almost every kind of early American home, and taffy pulling parties had even become a thing among the local communities. In the 20th and 19th centuries, families and friends would literally gather around to meet. Over some drinks and a lot of catching up, people would twist and stretch the cooling candy into these intricate long ropes that actually looked pretty decent too. The presentation was definitely, well, present here. Molasses and sorghum syrup were really good because they worked as key sweeteners in a time when you wanted to save your sugar, either for medicinal remedies and teas or for more nutritionally dense food. This was more of a feel-good thing, though. Still had to be practical, you know. It was cheap and easy to make, it was fun, and it lasted for weeks. It wasn't too uncommon for lots of people to basically just make insane batches of molasses taffy, preserve it for weeks, and then keep rolling it out as the impulse took over. Potato candy is something we get from the Great Depression, again from the Appalachian regions. Maybe they're as good at dessert making as they are at mountain climbing. The key ingredient here was actually mashed potatoes, though, so even back then, it was something that really took people by surprise. Nobody ever understood how you could get hard candy out of soft mashed potatoes. I mean, it kind of felt like one of those things shows do when they introduce alchemy, and now suddenly people can just turn things to gold. Despite its humble origins, though, potato candy started to become something that people held on to dearly because it was extremely cost-effective. You never had to worry about whether or not you were using too much out of your pantry or whether you were going to run yourself short of something. Potatoes were just so available. The trick, though, is interesting. See, cold mashed potatoes were mixed with sugar that had been powdered, and this would make this thick and sticky dough, right? So the next thing people did was roll it out into a thin sheet and roll it into a log. Once it was set, all you had to do was cut it up into whatever shape you wanted, and you were good to go. Churned buttermilk soup was something that was so nourishing for pioneers, farmers, and just about every family that lived on the rural side of America. Even the settlers from Scandinavia loved it. And that's how you know it has Mr. Worldwide status. It's made from leftover buttermilk, the one you get after you're done churning butter. Now people thought that this was just a poor man's attempt at a soup, but hey, if it works, don't knock it. Buttermilk soup is something that historically has roots in European peasant cuisine, especially in German and Scandinavian communities. But in America, it was only ever considered as a farm classic. Many homesteads were already in the process of churning their own butter, especially when they had a rising abundance of it. It was a byproduct that was pretty valuable, and it made no sense to waste it, so people just decided to take 20 minutes out of their day to make this soup instead. A meal that could go around the entire table and also make sure that nothing was being wasted. Also, it's not like you only had buttermilk and water in the soup. People would add in whatever dried fruits, berries, and other locally available ingredients they had. Sometimes they would just dip bread in it and eat it that way. It was a lot better than wasting the food, because sometimes the difference between going hungry that day and going to sleep moderately full was the buttermilk that was left over. It's 2024, and I'm sure none of you are strangers to the concept of gut health. We have the privilege of having lots of food science and research about this stuff coming out to support these claims and give us a better idea of what to eat and the impact of it all, but back then, people really just had feelings to go off of. The feeling of being refreshed, the feeling of waking up and feeling powerful, charged, clearer, and less bloated. All of that has to do with good gut health, and one of the best ways to take care of yours was with gut-healing chicken soup. From Colorado to Portland, Oregon, Brooklyn, and New York, it was so common to always have a bowl of this soup on the ready. It was a sign of the times. America was becoming aware of its growing obesity issues thanks to fast food culture, diners popping up everywhere, and a generational habit of greasy fried foods, which definitely hit home and feel like the peak of comfort but can never really help you in life. You simmer chicken, most times with the bone in as well, and then make this nutrient-rich broth with herbs and apple cider vinegar. All in all, it's a tasty dish that also makes sure you live easier and longer, so what's not to love here? Stuffed cabbage rolls were essentially comfort food for American farmhouse kitchens, especially those in the Midwestern regions. Their origins are something you can pinpoint to Jewish and Eastern European immigrants who first started bringing in recipes for cabbage rolls that had been a part of their traditions. Mind you, this is all stuff that's way back in the 19th and early 20th centuries, and over time, they've become big staples in the American cooking sphere. It's just that they're so good for cold weather, you know? If this video has taught you anything, let it be this. In the winters, cabbage is definitely your best friend. Stuffed cabbage rolls were something that were deeply relied upon by European peasants and impoverished families, so in tough times, farmhouses found that this recipe was actually working wonders. These rolls became popular in cities too, not just farmhouses. Pittsburgh, Cleveland, and Chicago were all places where the European cabbage craze continued captivating consistently. It's like suddenly everyone was a cabbage roll fan. Each community had its own way of making the dish too, like with Polish people you had a bit more creamy elements, with German people you had a bit more spice. The basic concept was the same though, and that's why I guess it was something people could enjoy no matter where they were. By the 1950s though, people were becoming aware of the lifestyle choices they were continuously making and how that was affecting things like their gut health. All the years of grills, wings, and casseroles take a toll on you. Still, it was hard for America to move on to no-protein salads that consisted almost entirely of Ivy League superfood vegetables like kale and broccoli. A better place to start the meat-addled population off was ham salad. This tangy, creamy salad involved a lot of diced ham blended with mayonnaise, mustard, pickles, onions, and just about every other familiar crutch you would need to get you into the habit of eating a salad. It wasn't the healthiest one, so to speak, but it was definitely a lot tastier and easier to swallow. Plus, you could throw in some croutons for some real fun and actually get to enjoying your salad. It was inexpensive too, since a lot of these vegetables aren't really ones that sink their teeth into your wallet. Ham is also one of the most common things in anyone's pantry, so it didn't take a lot to get familiar with this recipe. Dilled beef and cabbage stew is the ultimate in comfort food, adding a Scandinavian touch with the fresh, earthy flavor of dill. This hearty dish brings together tender beef chunks, cabbage, carrots, and potatoes, all uplifted by dill's herbaceous brightness. It's surprisingly refreshing for a winter stew, just right when you want something lighter than heavy gravies or sauces. Fun fact, cabbage is not just affordable but packed with vitamins C, K, and fiber, making it one of the healthiest veggies around. This recipe has its roots in Eastern European and Scandinavian kitchens, where cabbage was a winter staple, and Grandma knew it was a meal you could easily whip up from simple ingredients, yet still serve up a satisfying, flavorful dinner. For a little extra zing, add a splash of vinegar or a dollop of sour cream. Serve it with rye bread or boiled potatoes to soak up every drop of that tangy, herby broth. Cozy yet unique, this dilled beef and cabbage stew deserves a comeback as a winter classic. Speaking of those times, another really good source of protein was catfish, and one of the best ways to have it was fried catfish with hush puppies. This is again something that'll take us right to the heart of Southern cooking if we eat it. Along those rural places near rivers, lakes, ponds, and other bodies of water where you could find fresh catfish in abundance. Hush puppies were something made with fried cornmeal batter and were a popular dish to give to soldiers during the Civil War, so all in all, this dish was really light money-wise. Some basic Cajun spices or a Southern spice blend would make it even better into a real full-fledged meal that you could eat in comfort with the family. While it's been a big part of Southern cooking ever since the 19th century, it arguably had its biggest glory days in the 20th one as part of Southern soul food. There was a time in the 30s to 40s where soul food started to get into more and more menus across several places in the South, which wasn't always the case. Thank God it did, though, because steamed catfish definitely doesn't hit the spot quite like fried ones do with some golden brown hush puppies. If we step into the history of steamed molasses and bread, then you can see that Maine and Boston are a bit of a central hub for all things related to them. It's part of that New England culture. Baked beans, toast, steamed food, all of that is very common for people there. Molasses extend even further beyond that, because from the 1920s to the start of the 2000s, in a lot of rural and impoverished areas and the nation as a whole during the recession, molasses were the best way to keep your appetite filled and your family fed. You didn't have the luxury of always being able to go get a casserole or whatever shawarma you'd like. Some people only had molasses to work with, and they did their best to turn that into a memorable food experience too. I gotta say, I think they did the job pretty well, especially with how simple this recipe is. You wouldn't think cornmeal, buttermilk, and molasses steamed in a mold left in simmering water in a slow cooker could be so good, or even work just as well as a custard or a pudding. But here we are nonetheless. These ingredients are something you can find in literally any home, and they're always on grocery lists. It doesn't take a lot to get this dish going, and it may be the easiest one on the list so far. It has an extreme earthy sweetness to it, and it was really popular in neighborhoods where the average income was less. Things like ovens weren't something everybody was blessed with, but all the same, that doesn't have to mean they can't enjoy good food either, right? Blackberry dumplings were essentially one of the most resourceful farmhouse desserts. This was one of those things where you didn't even need to really work for it, you know? Blackberries were the kind of thing you could source easily. If it wasn't already being grown in your garden, then it was out there in the wild, and you could just forage it. Next, all you had to do was mix in some water and sugar, simmer, and craft the perfect syrupy base for your dessert. So, steaming a dessert isn't actually too common in most American recipes nowadays, but this was one of those recipes where you had to steam the dumplings until they were fluffy and just the right amount of soft. Some recipes also had a lot of cinnamon, nutmeg, lemon zest, things like that, thrown in all for extra flavor and to just give it a more well-rounded depth overall. Next, you would serve it with a whipped cream topping or just some vanilla ice cream on the side, and it was honestly a delight to eat. It showed people that you actually didn't need money or fancy ingredients to have a dessert that would do everything you needed it to. Plus, it was a summer dessert, so it really helped with the heat after a long day of working the farm. It didn't even need baking, just a stovetop and some cast iron skillets. If you really want to go the retro route, then you can't go without exploring all the gelatin madness that took over the 50s. It was a big trend too, especially with your salads. One in particular is something we're going to be taking a closer look at, and this time it's pina colada molded salad. This dish is the perfect example of what I'm talking about. It shows the elements of American cuisine slowly changing, with the introduction of more and more pineapple in salads and homemade dishes and other tropical ingredients like coconuts. It also foreshadows how much of a key player gelatin would eventually become in the overall landscape of American eating. This was usually lemon-flavored gelatin, and it was one looker of a dish, if nothing else, thanks to the use of it. It also helped that it had such vibrant and colorful fruits paired up with it too. Maraschino cherries and some pineapple do wonders for your aesthetic. Some people would also take it just a step further and add in rum flavoring, which would make the dish resemble a typical pina colada cocktail a lot more. All in all, it was one of the best and most fun ways to enjoy a salad again. Oxtail stew is a true comfort food, perfect for anyone who loves deep, meaty flavors with a luxuriously silky texture. Despite the name, oxtail simply refers to the tail of cattle, rich with collagen and connective tissue, making it perfect for slow-cooked dishes. As it simmers, oxtail transforms, becoming incredibly tender and melt in your mouth, with a broth so thick it's almost like gravy. Loaded up with carrots, potatoes, onions, and warming spices, oxtail stew feels both fancy and wonderfully homey. Enjoyed for centuries around the world, from Jamaican and Caribbean versions to European classics, oxtail has a humble yet flavorful history. And here's a fun fact. In medieval times, oxtail was considered a lesser cut, eaten mostly by peasants. Today, though, it's a delicacy with prices to match. The key to perfect oxtail stew? Patience. This is no quick meal. Slow cooking it for several hours brings out its full, rich flavor while letting the bones add even more depth to the broth. For an extra layer of flavor, try adding a splash of red wine or a dash of soy sauce. Serve with rice, mashed potatoes, or even dumplings to soak up every last drop of the hearty sauce. For a dish that's both rustic and refined, oxtail stew is a timeless favorite just waiting to be rediscovered in your kitchen. I know for a fact you've all grown up on some of your grandparents' baked ziti, especially if you have some Italian roots, and if you do, then you share that in common with this dish. Right from the streets of Italy, immigrants first brought this dish over in the middle of the 19th century throughout the early start of the 20th one, so it had a lot of time to become something that people could love and associate with the finer things in life. People had a lot of time by the mid-20th century to try this dish, and plenty of families had passed their own secret baked ziti recipes down. The baked ziti really hit its highest highs during that time period in the 1950s to the 1970s, and it was something you could enjoy at both a potluck and a fancy at-home date. It was a staple of Italian-American cooking, and you could even find it at weddings. I, for one, think that really speaks to how popular the dish was. But what's your experience with this dish? And if you don't have any yet, is it something you'd ever try out? Now here's something that started out in the bleakest of times but quickly became a sensation throughout America even after the Great Depression ended. You can't ever beat a fried bologna sandwich. I don't care what uptown neighborhood and what fancy restaurant you've been to. Something about that mix of bologna with cheese, mayo, and sometimes even bacon and sausages is unbeatable. It was something that was incredibly beloved by the public right after the Second World War ended, and the Midwest in particular couldn't really ever get enough of it. Diners, homes, rural areas, local breakfast joints, everyone was serving an affordable fried bologna sandwich. It was something you could rely on to both satisfy your taste buds, get you a healthy dose of protein, and not break your wallet if you had it daily, which was really asking for a lot in those times. Beef rendang was a highlight of New York dining. You could go to any neighborhood in Queens that was known for its beef and they would have rendang available, but it wasn't just New York. It was San Francisco and Los Angeles too, and in the former there was the Tenderloin district where meat-based dishes reigned supreme. The 1970s were the peak of beef rendang, and that's because it was around then that it got easy enough to make at home. People could enjoy it without going to a restaurant, thanks to slow cookers. Beef briskets were used to make rendang, but the magic was actually in this spice paste, which consisted of lemongrass, ginger, garlic, chilies, and turmeric. It sounds like a lot, but it's the genuine article, and it's bound to knock you out of the park no matter what dish you apply it to. Rendang is full of warm flavors, and it's as savory gets, plus the caramelized coating on the beef is really the cherry on top. It's usually served with rice, so if you ever feel like eating something out of an 80s animation, you can make some rendang. It comes closer than enough. Hog maw is this dish that was really popular with all sorts of Southern families. It was traditionally always prepared after hog butchering was done, and farm families, as you know, were very invested in getting all possible returns on investment. The stomach, or the maw of the hog, was thoroughly cleaned before it could be ready for the stuffing. Once the cleaning was done, which, mind you, was really a hard thing to do because you also had to blanch it properly, it would be stuffed with a mix of potatoes, onions, seasonings, and bits of sausage. Some different versions of it also used a bread stuffing or a cabbage depending on the place, but most areas stuck to the traditional recipes. This stuffed stomach would then be boiled or baked until it was tender, and if you were baking it, you would get some extra crispy bits of skin on the outside. They would then be sliced and served with different kinds of gravy or mustard and served with sauerkraut. This is a quintessential Pennsylvania Dutch and Southern America dish, and it's always something you would see at farm dinners or big holiday gatherings. Hog maw had a really smoky flavor despite what you're thinking. It wasn't overly gamey, and the sausage and seasonings really helped mask a lot of the metallic taste. For a lot of Depression-era related reasons, soup had become especially popular in America, especially cream soup, and one of the easiest ones to make was cream of celery soup. This was a traditional recipe that was popular in the South for many years. It was used to give easy nutrition to families and feed people on a budget. Both happened to be things that this recipe excelled at in particular. People would usually go extra hard on the cream to add some real texture to it, and it stopped feeling like a soup at some point with particularly cream-focused families. Still, it was good for getting some greens into people's diets, especially kids. People would typically just serve this with bread or another main course, but the dish was fine enough to eat on its own too. You might be wondering what I meant when I mentioned the Depression, though. During that entire period, and thanks to the war efforts later on too, soups and Americans had become pretty much best friends. They were one of the most convenient and healthiest ways to feed a crowd, and the acquired taste wasn't something the public was shaking off anytime soon. Sheepherder's stew is a hearty, no-frills dish with its roots in the lives of Basque herders working in the rugged American West. Made with lamb or mutton, potatoes, onions, and often some peas or green beans, it's a stew that's as rustic as it comes. The simplicity of ingredients made it perfect for cooking over a campfire out on the open range, offering a warm and filling meal to fuel those long, chilly days spent with the flock. Lamb lends the stew a deep, earthy flavor, while the vegetables bring sweetness and depth, creating a dish that's straightforward but utterly comforting. Here's a fun tidbit. Basque sheepherders typically used a single pot for all their cooking, making stews like this a practical and satisfying choice. They'd throw in whatever ingredients they had at the moment, letting everything simmer together for a meal that was both homestyle and efficient. For an added layer of flavor true to tradition, try a splash of red wine or a pinch of rosemary, or even a handful of barley for extra heartiness. Pair it with some bread or biscuits, and sheepherder's stew becomes the ultimate one-pot wonder, perfect for chilly evenings when you crave something simple, rustic, and warming. It's a little taste of history in every spoonful, just waiting to cozy up your evening. Hoppin' John is a dish that has some pretty rich heritage. I'm talking about African, Caribbean, and Native American roots that all boil together in the melting pot known as the South, where it first started becoming really trendy. However, the origins of the dish are actually a bit darker than just a happy coincidence that somehow got into everyone's table. Though the people who were eating it happily wouldn't know, it was first created and brought over by enslaved Africans in the American South. It made use of African rice and pork, and yes, the best part of the dish were the black-eyed peas even in those times. Now, as far as the name Hoppin' John is considered, nobody really ever knew where it first came from, or if there was a John who made this dish and brought it into everyone's lives, but the first time this name was mentioned was in the 1840s in a print. If you were down in the South and African American communities during New Year, then you would especially see a lot of Hoppin' Johns everywhere. The aroma of those peas and the smoked pork wouldn't miss anyone's nose, as the scent carried for miles and miles away. It was eaten specifically on New Year's because it was a common belief that eating Hoppin' Johns would bring good luck to people if they ate it to start the year. If you went into any new year with such a good plate of food, I'd say your luck was already pretty good, so maybe it does work? Soups and curries not to your liking? Let's head to the Indonesian side of things, where we can find popular recipes like sauté chicken, which used to be headliners for most cookbooks back in the day. Los Angeles has this area known as Thai Town, and San Francisco also has its own Chinatown. I bring these places up because they acted as footholds for dishes and cuisines like these to make a name for themselves and spread to the wider audience in America. Most of the time, these dishes did manage to gain a niche following. But that was the problem. It only ever stayed niche because it never lasted long enough to break into the mainstream. Stuff like this couldn't keep up with the trends of the country, whether because it wasn't accessible enough, like, for example, if you wanted sauté chicken, was it really worth it to get up and go all the way to Thai Town from another part of the city? That's why slow cookers were so nice to have around when they eventually did become mass-produced. Sauté chicken is usually grilled, but it can be slow-cooked and left to marinate in a sauce made of turmeric, coriander, and lemongrass, as well as chili paste. If you really want to keep it a touch more American, You can always grill it further after the slow cooking since it will be served on skewers, but the dish works great even if you just cook it in a crock pot. And it's a great way to switch up Meatloaf Mondays when the whole family isn't giving the most excitable reaction to that idea. Now, the thing about sorrel soup is that while it has roots in European peasant cooking, it was actually fought on over by so many different kinds of Americans that it's most likely lost its original touch now. Eastern European immigrants, Germans, and Dutch people that came and settled in Pennsylvania were known as the Pennsylvania Dutch, and they most often made homes in the areas I've been mentioning throughout the video so far. Then there was sorrel, which was this really lemony-tasting green that was one of the earliest vegetables you could plant and harvest. It would come right at the start of spring, meaning that it was one of the vegetables people would plant immediately and always be looking out for. You would look forward to eating something like that after a long, cold, and grueling winter, wouldn't you? Fresh sorrel leaves were precious to people. They would be taken from gardens or foraged, and they were wilted in butter, simmered in broth, mixed with vegetables, and served hot or chilled with some sour cream. Not only was it a wonderfully refreshing and nutritious dish to add, it was also really heartwarming to have something like that. It means something to restore strength to a person's body, but helping them feel better is a whole other animal entirely. Two aspects of the 1950s that are largely forgotten were ducklings and roasts. These concepts had a perfect marriage in one recipe, and that was cranberry orange roast ducklings. It was a really celebratory dish, the kind of thing you would roll out for big days and events, maybe a birthday, maybe a holiday dinner. Either way, it was a recipe that utmost home chefs and grandmothers really kept close to their hearts. They even passed it down in family cookbooks for generations, so go figure. One of the best things about this dish was also its use of cranberries, which are particularly a holiday season favorite in America. The ducklings were used for their tender meat, and the roasting was done to give it some crispy skin and juicy meat. This was one savory dish that also used a lot of sweeteners on top of the already zest-filled oranges. It used things like maple syrup and honey, and this was actually done so that the cranberries wouldn't be too overbearing. You had to be pretty thorough with the prep work here, which is why it was a dish that veteran grandmothers excelled in. Mulligan stew is typically a leftover dish, and indeed, it is the definition of throwing together everything except for the kitchen sink. It has its roots in the Great Depression when individuals combined all sorts of commodities that were edible in a pot: meat, vegetables, beans, pasta, and anything that could be imagined. Thus, no two Mulligan stews are the same. It is one of the most versatile, or rather, one of the most lenient, dishes to prepare. Mulligan stew is based on what is known as the hobo stew, in which you subject various ingredients to uncertain fates that result in an amazing stew. The factor that makes Mulligan stew stand out is the fact that it is one of the cheapest meals that can be prepared. Got leftover beef? Toss it in. An extra can of beans? Throw it in too. This consists of potatoes, carrots, onions, tomatoes, some appetizers, and whatever remains in the kitchen. In the Great Depression, massive quantities of Mulligan stew would be cooked in large batches, and everyone would bring something to the kettle. This sharing and utilization of every little component is the essence of Mulligan stew. Oh, no preparations here, simply use your creativity. To give it a boost, season with a hint of Worcestershire, or alternatively, season with a pinch of paprika. So the next time you find your fridge is almost empty, then maybe it is time to bring out the Depression-era chef in you and try out Mulligan stew. It is the stew equivalent of the Mystery Box Challenge and will surely warm you. It seems like wherever you go in America, the impact of the French is something you can see from miles away. Some people argue with statements like that, and to them I say, why were so many dishes like coq au vin popular in the middle of the 20th century? Why did Julia Chef literally start a nationwide curiosity for their cooking? Why are there so many restaurants trying to emulate the cuisine? The proof is in the pudding. Either way, there's few cultures that are better for food inspiration than France is, and it makes sense why a cultural melting pot like the United States has always been inclined towards their cooking. From the presidents to the common folk, everyone loves dishes mixed with red wine and that French dazzle we're all so used to. Coq au vin is definitely like that, since you braise a rooster in red wine with mushrooms and bacon, then slow cook it until everything is mixed together. You want the chicken to taste just like everything else you put in with it, to the point where that original gamey taste of the meat gets overpowered. It's got an incredibly robust flavor, and the braising only brings that out tenfold. Places like Delmonico's in New York or many French restaurants in San Francisco would always serve dishes like these, and since slow cookers became a thing, it became accessible for people to make at home too. So here's a cuisine that hasn't made an elaborate appearance on the list so far, which is German cooking. Brown bread in a can. Yup, that's the entire premise of this one. And I know you might already be interested in hitting that fast forward button over there a few times, but hear me out for a second. This is a classic dish and I'm going to give you 3 seconds maximum to guess it because it's really obvious. 1, 2, 3. Okay, so if it wasn't clear enough, it's popular in New England because, of course, where else do you hear about things like that? It was something that colonists had brought on over during the very start of the colonial era, and it was during when wheat flour was generally considered a scarce resource in most places. Rye and cornmeal were the more popular substitute for people, especially when it came to cheating on nice steamed breads. These breads were in hot demand in places like Boston, Vermont, and Maine, and farmhouses there would sell them whenever they could for a quick buck. So, one of the ways of making this easily marketable, hotly demanded steamed bread was by making brown bread in a can, and the cans would be placed in pots of simmering water and steamed for 2 to 3 hours properly and thoroughly, right? They really had to get in there and make sure his baby was being put through a sauna properly. This was a signature New England dish that would most often be served with baked beans and some salt pork, which, believe it or not, was actually a very typical Boston Saturday night dinner. On the other hand, if you wanted to have a summer dish that really put you in the mood for the season, there wasn't anything better to go with in the 1950s than Holi Holi chicken wings. This Hawaiian dish pays homage to the state's incredible love of all things grilled and the harmony between the sweet and the savory. Huli is the Hawaiian word for turn, and it refers to the act of turning a chicken while you're grilling it on the spit to make sure that you get perfectly even cooking. Some of the influences in this dish are Asian, but a lot of it is also pretty strictly Hawaiian. I mean, it uses pineapple juice after all. It does use a lot of marination though, with the most extreme recipes even asking you to leave it up overnight. You have your typical culprits in ginger and garlic, but it also uses a lot of chili peppers to add a spicy kick to it. The marination really helps the case for Holi Holi wings because it means that it's extremely hard to outdo these in terms of flavor. They're honestly one of the best meals you could have at a party. Of course, our grandmothers always knew how to switch up each dish. To elevate the recipe itself, they would often brush the wings with extra marinade while grilling, creating a sticky, caramelized glaze that was irresistible. Served with a side of fresh coleslaw or grilled corn, Holi Holi chicken wings embodied the vibrant flavors of Hawaiian cuisine. The smoky char from the grill combined with the tangy sweetness of pineapple juice made this dish a standout at summer gatherings. It wasn't just about the taste, it was also about the fun of outdoor grilling and the festive vibe it brought to any dinner grandmas in the 50s did. This is a very classic dish that was often prepared by grandma in winter. Do not be put off by the word rabbit. It's a tender, lean meat with a mild flavor that's often compared to chicken, but with a bit more character. Oh, and by the way, I'm talking about rabbit stew. The meat of rabbit is rich in proteins and comparatively has less fat content than most meats. Now, this stew defines comfort and health altogether. The basic ingredients for rabbit stew are root vegetables such as carrots, potatoes, onions, and mushrooms cooked in a meaty gravy. This dish has deep roots in European cooking, especially in France and Italy, where rabbits were a backyard staple. Fun fact, rabbit meat is probably one of the world's most eco-friendly sources of meat since it needs fewer resources for production than other meats such as beef. To get the best out of your rabbit stew, cook it low and slow, letting the meat fall off the bone and infuse the broth with a rich, gamey flavor. If you're feeling adventurous, pour a few spoonfuls of red wine into the pot, or spice it up with a few twirls of thyme and rosemary. Accompany it with a crusty loaf of bread for the bread dipping accompaniment, and you've got yourself a stew that's comforting, tangy, and a tad exotic. A real winter favorite that needs a revival. You hear the name rumaki and you might start thinking about some pretty exotic dishes, but it's actually more of a humble appetizer that picks a few flavors and does them really, really well. It was also made at Trader Vic's, a Polynesian-style restaurant right here in Uncle Sam's USA, which I'm sure you didn't see coming either. I wouldn't blame you for thinking it's exotic, since at tiki parties it was definitely considered that, and when tiki culture as a whole started erupting into the mainstream of American eating, it was still sought after, with just as much interest. The dish itself also makes use of some things that aren't familiar, and some that are, like chicken livers, water chestnuts, and bacon. It was a really good hors d'oeuvre that boomed in popularity after the World War II era, though you'd be pretty stumped if you tried to go out and look for it today. Still, it's kind of sad we can't go out to parties and experience chestnuts and crispy bacon anymore, wouldn't you agree? Or is tiki cooking not really up your alley? Now that's what we call the best of pioneer recipes. Comment down below which one you'll make soon, and don't forget to like and subscribe.